So my most memorable wildlife experience happens to be at the mouth of Laguna Creek. Um, Long before I started working for the city, I was surfing out there, mostly because it's a surf spot where you can go and get away from the crowds in town. And it's a little bit of a scary spot because it's a good distance from the road and there's lots of wildlife out there and stuff, but it's really beautiful. And I was surfing alone just to add a little more potential drama to the situation, and a whale popped up next to me, 50 feet from the beach. And at first I panicked, and luckily I didn't panic too much, but then I noticed, oh yeah, that's a mammal, that's not a fish. So it was a whale and it wasn't a shark, and that made my day, although it was still a little unsettling just thinking of what the potential ramifications might be if the whale were to flip its tail and hit me or something, or breach. And I imagine it was a gray whale just because it was so close to the beach. But that's one of those things that happens in a matter of seconds that you just is a vivid memory that one of the most vivid memories I have of my life. And having been as a teenager wanting to be Jacques Cousteau, and moving from the East Coast to Santa Barbara to study aquatic biology, that was sort of just a big experience for me in my life. Again, surfing out at Laguna Creek way before I worked out there, that was kind of neat. And then when I got to work out there, it was even better because it was like I had this personal connection, and I had this sort of sea to the skyline relationship with that watershed that I thankfully get paid to investigate and explore. I've been lucky enough to be involved in bringing back coho in Laguna Creek too, which, as much as the whale story is a big one for me, the coho story is a bigger one for me and for many other people, just because there's so many people involved in trying to bring coho back south of the Golden Gate. So Laguna was pretty impressive, but I've been lucky enough to have several other wildlife experiences with more upland species. Mount Herman June beetle, we have an HCP for June beetle that part of it occurs up in the sandhills at the headwaters. This watershed, Laguna Creek, is so diverse in terms of the biology, but also in terms of the geology. There's karst in the headwaters, there's the sandhills, there's the really amazing dripstone further down in the creek, down about 1.5 miles from Highway 1. There's a neat area where there's stalactites hanging from the cliff faces along the creek. I think one of the oldest cultural resource sites on the coast is found there, out at Sandhill Bluff. So there's the whale story at Laguna kind of opened my eyes to this rich watershed, having this long human occupation, great biodiversity, geologic diversity, and the city of Santa Cruz has relied on this watershed for water since the 1800s. So there's a lot of more modern cultural history there as well. When I first started here, the sort of the driving regulations for the water industry was the Safe Drinking Water Act, and because of that, the city had always chosen to use Laguna Creek first and foremost because it's the cleanest and cheapest water that we have. However, shortly thereafter, the Endangered Species Act became a more meaningful piece of regulations under the Clinton administration, and coho salmon were among several other local species that were listed. And so we had the Safe Drinking Water Act governing what the city does in terms of public health, but the Endangered Species Act sort of was diametrically opposed to that, because if you were to follow what's best for the fish and less good for the people, so to speak, you would probably choose your lower quality water sources. So that's been an ongoing conflict that the city's been wrangling with for going on 20 years now. But in the last few years, we've had the opportunity to, both working with NIMS and the Department of Fish and Wildlife, NIMS has been doing all kinds of research and obviously helping the hatchery efforts to restore coho runs. We've been working with NIMS and DFW to put more water back in the streams. Here's a pretty important picture, a couple of pictures in 2007 when we first turned water out for fish in Laguna Creek. That's the former production superintendent, Jim Bentley, releasing our first official bypass flow on Laguna Creek. We have, when I first started here, Laguna Creek was dry, bone dry in the summertime and the fall as well. And I remember seeing that and thinking, wow, that can't be. But, that was the historic practice. And at that time, the coho had just been listed, so the operations hadn't quite caught up to the current status of the federal listing. Here's a picture of the Laguna Creek Lagoon in 2004, which I believe was an average water year, and it's almost dried up. And then in 2013, I believe, which was, I think it was a dry year. It certainly was part of the current, not the current, but the recent drought period we had. And we had improved bypass flows, and we had a much higher lagoon. So things had changed quite a bit in that period of time. An interesting little anecdote about the 2004 photo. You can see this little backwater area here that's completely dried up. That's really rich tidewater goby and red-legged frog habitat. We've also seen western pond turtle there. But at this time, Matt Baldzikowski, who used to work for us, we were out doing fish surveys one day, and he found some bones out there. And Matt, being a former archaeologist for state parks, was smart enough to know what those were. And he called the county coroner, and he said, hey, we have a body out here. And the coroner said, how do you know it's a body and it's not a cow? And all those questions that they ask people reporting things like that are fairly startling. And Matt said very deadpan, well, cows don't have fillings. So there's I guess the connection to my story there is that this is the human element of the Laguna watershed in the Monterey Bay is an element that can't be overlooked. We do have these great natural resources and great biodiversity, but the humans are forever interwoven with that story, whether it be the collapse of the fishery in Monterey that Steinbeck wrote about, or the extirpation of coho, or exotic species taking over our sandhills. We've been reading a lot about French broom lately. Humans are obviously part of the Monterey Bay story. So here's a picture from 2003 of, let's see if I have this right. There is, unfortunately he got cut off, but John Ambrose from National Marine Fisheries Service was standing right here, and he didn't quite fit on the paper, but that's bone dry. That's right below the confluence with Y Creek. Let's see if I have a couple more photos. This is that same reach last week with pools that are probably 8 feet deep, plenty of fish. To quote our regulators who were out there with us, they thought the creek looked just fabulous, and it does look way better than it used to. So that's pretty gratifying to have been part of that over the last 15 or 20 years. Certainly took a lot of effort from the regulators and city staff, and painful changes for the customers of the city of Santa Cruz. We just recently went through the long drought, which were, thankfully the ratepayers really performed in their conservation, and we were able to provide good fish flows and made it through the drought relatively unscathed. Of course, with climate change ahead of us, we need to be thinking about what are we going to do for supply in the next drought. Just for a little more historical context, here's the first adult coho that I'm aware of being found in modern time that Matt Baldzikowski found in 2005 and brought back to the office and said, what do we do with this? And I said, we go talk to Sean Hayes and the folks at the NOAA lab at Terrace Point and ask them what we should do. And they thanked us and went out and did juvenile monitoring the following summer and found juveniles in 2005. We didn't see more fish for another 10 years. In 2015, which was another drought year, we found young of the year during our own surveys. And then last year, I was lucky enough to be able to go out and film some underwater footage, and we found some more juveniles, coho juveniles, in 2016. So we have, right here, you can see there's a couple of them swimming by. Anyway, so we've got a couple of years of successful reproduction in Laguna Creek now, which is it's a really good start on bringing back coho south of the Golden Gate. So Another little bit of my story. The first habitat typing I did on Laguna Creek in 2001, I don't think I'd ever seen an adult steelhead or a red-legged frog. And in one of the first pools that I was measuring, I found an adult steelhead 6 inches away from a red-legged frog. So there's the frog and there's the steelhead. It's a pretty terrible picture, but it just, again, reinforced for me what a important and biodiverse watershed it is, and how important it is to balance the water supply needs of the watershed as well as the in-stream biotic needs. So the coho are connected to this story in the sense that they are anadromous fish. They have a very rigid life history, but they do, they come in from sea as adults and they spawn, and then the adults die in the creek, and then the juveniles outmigrate when they're somewhat more mature, like say around 100 millimeters, 110 or more. When they're small size, they start to go out. So for me, that's sort of the gratifying thing about my job. I originally said I started out thinking I'd be Jacques Cousteau, but to be able to have this marine connection with working in the watersheds is gratifying, because it's I think sometimes people forget their connection to the sea, and when you're working in a watershed where you have anadromous fish, you can't help but remember that it is a sea to the skyline and a skyline to the sea kind of process. And the watersheds drain to the sea, obviously, so it's a little bit easier to be reminded that you do have that connection to the ocean, even though you're inland, when you've got fish that are coming in and reminding you of that.